God shows up in every one of these places, not just when we reach a certain number.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Teresa Stewart, and the subject is the small church worship advantage. Teresa is the author of a great book called The Small Church Advantage: 7 Powerful Worship Practices That Work Best in Small Settings. So in this episode, Teresa and I will talk about the specifics of the worship experience in the small church, how it's different from our big church friends, and how that difference is something to embrace, not avoid. Teresa's approach is simple, it's practical, and it's applicable in most small church settings. She challenges some of the ways we've thought about small church worship, she offers viable alternatives, and then she gives some wonderful step-by-step advice about how to curate worship to be more participatory without letting chaos just run the day for the small church. Don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'm going to come back with some additional thoughts about how the big church, small church dynamic that we experience on a regular basis plays into all of this, and we're going to talk about some information that we simply didn't have time for in the interview. Also, as a reminder, we're just weeks away from the release of my new book, De-Sizing the Church: How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. So I wanted to let you know that we're putting together a series of podcasts that we'll be releasing on a weekly basis instead of our usually bi-weekly schedule, in which we're going to talk about some of the themes of my new book, including interviews with some of the authors that I cite in the book. Be on the lookout for those starting in April. Well, Teresa, thank you so much for being with me today on the Church Lobby podcast. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this ever since I read your book. I picked it up in 2023. I wrote about it as one of my top reads of the year for 2023. And by far, it's the best book about small churches that I've read in quite some time. Really, really so many good things in it, and some surprising things as well. So I really want to talk about it because some of it surprised me, and I know it will surprise and delight our listeners as well. Quite frankly, I'm going to have to resist the temptation to simply read quote after quote after quote.
I would just hope I would still agree with myself. That's the only challenge.
Not only do you make good points, but you write well. And so there are moments as a writer myself where I just pause and go, oh, I love the way she phrased that. In fact, this is one of the books that I wish I had read your book before I was in absolute dead final editing mode for my new book, De-Sizing the Church, because there are several times where I went, oh, I would have used that in my book. I would have quoted her for that. So we'll have to make do with the podcast for that. But let's get into it. So the title of your book, again, is The Small Church Advantage. Actually, not again, we haven't said it yet. The Small Church Advantage: 7 Powerful Worship Practices That Work Best in Small Settings. And so you're not talking about small churches in general, but you're really talking specifically about the worship experience when the small church gathers. And what you say is you take what you call a strength-based approach to worship in the small church, which is really different from how a lot of people think about worship in the small church. So tell us, what does it mean to take a strengths-based approach?
Well, I think it's the opposite end of what we've ended up with too often, which is kind of a pathologizing cycle where we treat small congregations as if they're miniaturized big ones. And then we start saying, oh, but here are all the ways they're not really working. The singing isn't great, the music, the preaching. And then once we have a list of all the things that don't measure up to a model that didn't fit to begin with, then we start plugging in fixes, and it's a little bit like spackling a wall and painting over it. You keep chasing the pathologies, the weaknesses. And a strengths-based approach is actually something that's preferred across lots of disciplines, whether it's therapy or architecture or teaching, which is instead of starting with what's going wrong, you start with what are the inherent strengths here and say, what could we design with these? What if we started with these? What if we started with the strengths? What could we build? And remarkably, what happens is whether you're looking for weaknesses or strengths, you end up finding what you look for. And the church has, for a long time, with small congregations, been looking for the weaknesses and their imitation of a big church model that is not their highest and best design.
Any of us who have been in small church ministry for any time have recognized, I've written about it at length, just a general idea that we can't just follow the big church model. It's not plug and play. You can't just do it smaller. You can't just do it the same, only smaller, because it simply doesn't fit. But you take that approach specifically to the worship experience in ways that I hadn't seen or considered before. In fact, when it comes to worship, of all the ways that small churches feel inadequate compared to our big church friends, not having those musicians, not having the professionalism of musicianship and of singers is often top of the list for small churches.
But I would also challenge that, because I think that in our culture now, we have such a high setting for production value and performance value that we sometimes can't see past it. And yet, as humans, we are wired for a variety of aesthetics. And that's that, $2 word that has to do with where do we find things of beauty or things that fit. For instance, we know how to behave and receive the gifts of a potluck differently than going to a formal wedding reception with 300 people present. We know that those are different events and they call for different things from us, and we get to experience a different kind of participation and conviviality and liveness and sharing of things and shaping and collaborating an event together when we're at a potluck birthday party, for example, than we do if we walk into a formal event with 300 people and we know that our job is to largely sit still and listen to something. And it's my argument that that potluck model is not only different, it actually has some powerful strengths for what it means to worship and receive and proclaim the gospel. The fact that it can be changed with each person who shows up, the value of each person, that our job is not to just sit passively and watch an expert do something, that those work beautifully with what our gospel says this value is of gathering before God and worshiping together. So we simply have to switch that mindset from performative to participation in our expectations.
Oh, yeah, I fully agree. I think it's one of the unintended byproducts of the advent of the megachurch and of the church growth movement. Again, it's an unintended byproduct. Nobody set out to alienate the small church. But as churches started to get larger, and you point this out beautifully several ways in your book, as churches start getting larger, then there are certain things that need to be done in a large room, such as, I don't know that you use this term, but such as a little more generic approach to things like symbols, and we'll get into symbols in a little bit, and to an experience that is going to hit everybody in the room. And it can't be really unique. It can't be quirky. It can't be specific because you've got such a large room with so many different types of people. So it has to be a little more generic. And in the small church, we get to be quirky and specific and interesting and individualized. And that doesn't fit in the big context. What they do in the big context doesn't fit in the small. But what are some of the things we've lost by trying to copy? And again, this is a term you may not use. And if it's an incorrect term as far as what you're concerned, you can change that from me. But what do we lose when we try to copy the fairly generic one-size-fits-all approach of the megachurch, which again has to be done when you've got that many people in the room, and try to incorporate that in the small church? Not only can't we do it, but we actually lose a lot when we try, don't we?
I think that's exactly right. That this idea that there is one universal sermon just flies in the face of what we know about what Paul was preaching at various places, or what Jesus spoke to different groups. The good news announces itself in particular ways for each community. And so the idea of a universal sermon, a universal approach, what we end up with is actually using least common denominator symbols and signs rather than the things that speak most powerfully in each community. And what we end up with is saying, maybe yours aren't good enough. Trust that these experts have the right gifts to bring, instead of saying, our community right where we are, has everything it needs to worship, everything it needs to bring to God. We bring our best gifts before God. So you get particularity. You also get a different take on what the gospel calls us in to do, to participate together in this, to bring our best gifts, that God shows up in each community, not just once we can pass under the sign that says you must be this tall to enter, or you must have this many members to enter. That's the wildly radical idea, is we actually have a theology that says God shows up in every one of these places, not just when we reach a certain number. It is living out the gospel with our very bodies. It is telling the people that we're worshiping with that what you have is welcomed into the arms of divine love, that your gifts are enough, and God can bless and speak in your language to this group right here. And that becomes really powerful for folks.
You use a phrase called the happy birthday effect, which to me drew a picture just so vividly about what we're talking about here. So what is the happy birthday effect, and how does that play itself out in small churches?
This is one of my favorite pieces to tease out with people. I just think it's fascinating. The happy birthday effect. Imagine for a moment this potluck barbecue birthday celebration, and people are coming in, and of course they linger in the kitchen and they go sit wherever they want. But at some moment, someone brings out a birthday cake with candles on it, and everybody breaks into song, "Happy birthday to you," and they blow it out. And at the end of that party, with all the things that have happened, people don't drive home and go, "Oh my gosh, I wish those altos had been in tune. Why didn't we practice more? I kind of wish we'd brought in a professional choir, or at least had some practice. Maybe we just needed some professional music or recording. That would have been." But you don't do that, because here's the thing, the magic of that happy birthday effect. When we participate and bring our gifts to co-create or collaborate with something, then it actually changes our critical function, because it switches us from performing to belonging. And so we experience that as a joyful event, not a performance to be critiqued. And this is, if participation shifts our critical function, think about what that does. Instead of getting heightened critical function production performance analysis, which is kind of what the large church has to invite if you're trying to deal with large groups of people, we have the ability in small congregations of doing things for the sake of collaboration and belonging and seeing what we can create together. And it invokes a different sense of how we evaluate it. Did I belong? Did we have fun? Was it a joyful noise? Rather than, were we on pitch and would anyone buy this record?
Because the truth of the matter is, no, it wasn't, and no, they wouldn't.
And it doesn't matter.
And not only does it not matter, but in some ways, that's actually part of the joy of it. Let's just go to the happy birthday thing when everybody's singing. I intentionally am the weird uncle who intentionally sings it too high, too loud, and off key. I'm a fairly good singer. I've been in musical groups. I can pick a part and sing it. I can read music, but I like being the goofy guy who doesn't do that. And everybody looks at me and goes, what's wrong with Karl today? It's part of the fun of singing happy birthday, is you do it that way. And I'm not telling anybody to go out there and go to church and sing off key and loud intentionally. But that distinction, that is a part of the process and part of the joy of the small church. It's not a negative, it's a positive. A lot of this comes under, you mentioned the word earlier, aesthetics. And you write a lot about aesthetic cues. So first of all, what are aesthetic cues? And secondly, why do they matter and how do they work in the small church?
Well, aesthetics is really fascinating, because we are so designed to appreciate and work with aesthetics that we don't even realize it. So for instance, we appreciate that walking into the architecture of a federal courthouse, we automatically adjust our voices, our body, when we encounter those kind of symbols of authority. No one has to present us with something and say, "Now here's how you talk," and you don't yell out. And we kind of gather that from the aesthetic cues that are given to us by the architecture and patterns. But if we show up at a T-ball game, our behavior changes entirely. And that behavior is different than showing up at a honky tonk, what we might say to each other. You don't show up at a honky tonk and decide that you're going to practice your ballet moves. I mean, there are cues telling us what's appropriate behavior, what is fitting behavior, what is beautiful in the setting, and how we should respond. And part of what large congregations do is they have to be good at sending the aesthetic cues of this event is going to go on the same whether you're here or not. Because the anxiety of 2,000 people gathered together would be unsettling if you don't have, I'm the leader, follow me, look up here, everything is clear. But in a small congregation, you can open that up to more of that potluck effect where the aesthetic cues say, you have a voice in this. Your presence, just by being here, shapes it. And your behavior is invited in a different way. The cues at that big, like a formal wedding reception, might very well make everybody uncomfortable if someone shows up unprepared to give a toast when they're supposed to. But in a small setting, you can have more informality around how people participate and what they bring to it. And the event is not simply repeatable. It's not designed to simply be repeatable. The cues tell you that your presence there matters differently.
For years, we've, as small church pastors, have felt secondary to that kind of an aesthetic. And what you lay out really well, both in what you've just said as well as in your book, is that we're not secondary to that. We simply have a different aesthetic. So you mentioned, for instance, Little League game. The Little League game, going to watch a Little League game and going to watch a big league, Major League Baseball game, it's the same, technically by the rules, it's pretty much the same game on the field, but we all know it's not the same game. The technical excellence of the people on the field is vastly different one to the other. And the experience in the stands is vastly different, but no one who is going to watch their child or grandchild play Little League is going to say that that experience was a lesser experience than watching a big league baseball game where they've never met anybody on the field personally at all. They are totally different experiences, but that is not a lesser experience. In many ways, it's a better experience because of the family bonding and because we actually know the people who are involved. And in the small church, it's exactly the same way. But when we try to transfer the big league to the Little League, if all of a sudden we start expecting a level of excellence from 7-year-olds, we expect from that. But that's not, and I'm even, help me out with this, because I even used the word excellent and cringed at my use of the word excellence there, because it's not even less excellence. It's just a different aesthetic, right?
What I would say, it's performative excellence as opposed to patient excellence. And one of the things I would say is sometimes when I'm working with small congregation pastors and they are just doing their dead level best and they don't understand why the congregation won't participate, why people aren't, it's because they are very subtly and beyond their consciousness signaling cues to the congregation that this is a performance event. And I'm the MC, I'm the expert up here, everything depends on me, and I'm going to do this for you. And then there's going to be, and so some of the tools in the book, for instance, like conversation, open that and change that up, because you cannot have different kinds of conversation included in worship and preserve the idea that it is a performance event. But too often, and this goes to a place where I explain in the book that I was teaching groups of small congregation pastors. And when I asked the question, when have you experienced excellent worship? They described these formal big events with beautiful prayers and everything was planned out so beautifully. And I realized that none of them, that couldn't be replicated in any of their settings. But when I changed the question to when have you been deeply formed by worship, I got participation stories of practices that they'd engaged in over long periods of time. And worship is a formation event. It is not simply watching a performance of someone else. And small congregations are the ones that can bring that forward.
It was one of my favorite quotes. I had it here to ask you about, so I'm glad you brought it up. But the way we ask the question and the kinds of questions we ask change the kinds of answers we're going to get. So we've got these aesthetic cues. How do we begin to change the aesthetic cues from cues that, and again, for those who are listening, some of you hearing this for the first time, just like I read it for the first time and the book went, oh, you're right. I am cueing people that this is a performance event that you sit and watch. And I'm doing that unintentionally. The question then becomes, one, how do we change from those, you're going to sit and watch me do this for a while, cue, to something more participatory without getting weird? Because that's the fear that every pastor in their heart has right now. Okay, I get what you're saying, but I can't just swing the doors open and let the crazy out. So how do we do that?
I think one of the things we do is we recognize that we will stumble and be weird and things won't be perfect. And isn't it remarkable that the good news has some things to say to that, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It will not fall apart. We don't have the view that pastors must be perfect and not weird and performance excellent in order for God to show up. God's going to show up. We're there together for that. The other thing that I would say is it's worth going kind of a step at a time. And I suggest a way called stone soup worship planning that kind of flips on its head what most large congregations would do with a worship design team. And you start looking at how do you curate worship? How do you take the gifts in this place, not just your congregation, but your community, and articulate the good news in worship with them? And so our worship gifts are not simply sit, stand, sing, pray. Our worship gifts can include all kinds of things that then can be curated in worship, but then practicing, how are we getting people's, I call it contact, their hands on so that they actually shape the worship itself? How do their words affect it? We have a long tradition in Christianity of the sermon not simply being 20 minutes by an expert where no one can talk back, but lots of other forms that include the community and congregation, the gathered folks before God. And so using those and practicing them. And what I would say is these 7 powerful practices are really not, and here's your recipe card, but they are an invitation to just work differently. And when you work differently, it will take about a year. I've seen some congregations move much faster, but to start seeing cues in other places and realizing, oh, this is more like a potluck than a formal wedding reception.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to karlvaters.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. Where I live, a few years ago, there were a couple churches that decided they wanted to shift the paradigm from sit and watch to completely wide open for anybody. And they literally sat and just simply waited for, they would use phrases like for God to move or for the Spirit to show up. And because there was zero curating, you used the word, I love that word. There was zero curating of it, because stone soup is not just simply whatever happens, happens. It's picking the right ingredients. But because of that, it ended up with the crazy taking over. And then anybody who was watching that was like, they battened down the hatches even harder on you just sit and watch me because we're not going there. So what you're talking about is a wonderful, healthy middle ground that fits well in the small church dynamic. But again, let's talk about some of the curating things, because you talk about, in addition to the aesthetic cues, you talk about a participation aesthetic. And here's one of my favorite quotes. So far, I've resisted just quoting you time after time, but I'm going to do this one. We need to treat worship, I love this, like a full body contact sport. Get worshipers hands on as much stuff as possible and as often as possible. And then you also say this, I've been very fascinated the last couple of years by brain science. And you say this, neuroscientists, great teachers, and Christian educators agree that full body encounters form us deeply. The idea that we are not just sitting and watching, but we're physically involved. In most churches, the only time that happens is when we're singing along with the worship team. But in small churches, you say, we can really have a participation aesthetic that allows us to physically get involved, but it's not just come whatever mayhem. It is curated in some very important ways that allows those things to happen within a format that makes sense to the small church. Walk us through some of that, because that's fascinating to me.
Unpack what curating is. A museum curator takes a collection of lots of different things and says, I want to tell the story of X. And so I will take different things from my collection and put them together so that all alongside each other, they tell a particular story from this much bigger collection. Well, as Christians, we have enormous collections. We have things from our tradition. We have, there are lots of resources that various denominations have offered. We also have the gifts of those sitting in church or the whole community. Those are all gifts as well that can be used to tell the story of the good news. The way this works, though, is in order to avoid the chaos factor, the pastor would identify each week the focus scripture, a theme or symbol or an idea, and would provide that over a month's time. Then spend the time really recruiting and understanding the collection of gifts around him or her. And then inviting them, would you do something for the children? Would you read? Would you invite people into a call to worship? All of those pieces. Now, you don't know exactly what's going to show up, but you've guided it gently. It's about gently guiding. When you show up to a museum to see a collection, they don't tell you exactly what you have to think about all of it. You're allowed to interact with each piece of it. And that's what we're doing in worship. We're guiding it with, the pastor or the pastor and a lay member or a lay member puts together a gentle guiding structure, but then invites the community to interpret it.
Another word might be there's a template, or there's an architectural plan of some type, but it's not fully fleshed out. It builds in spaces for people to fill in with their participation and with the things that they bring to it. One of the things I want to talk about in the bonus material, I want to talk with you about the role of conversation in small church worship, because that's one of those things that, again, immediately frightens a lot of us because we've seen things go off the rail, but you walk us through it really well. So for those of you who are listening who would like to get the bonus material, all you have to do is go to karlvaters.com/support or karlvaters.com/subscribe. If you go and you support us on a monthly basis financially, then you will get the free newsletter that has the link to all of the bonus material for all of the podcasts that we do that for, or you can get it for free by getting our free weekly newsletter by going to karlvaters.com/subscribe. Either way, that's how you can get the link. So we're going to do 5 to 10 minutes at the end of this about the role of conversation in small church worship. There's some great things that Teresa has to say about that. But for now, you have mentioned a couple times the role of symbols. You say symbols are powerful and deep meaning makers. We all know this. The large churches understand that. And to go back to my question earlier, in large churches, the symbols have to be fairly generic and quite large. They have to be seen from a distance. They have to be seen in a room of hundreds or thousands. They have to be physically large, and they have to be designed and created by professionals because it has to fit the aesthetic of that large place. In a small congregation, 1, they don't need to be done by professionals. 2, they don't need to be huge. 3, they don't need to be generic. So talk to us about the value of symbols in the small church and allowing this participation aesthetic to feed into the kinds of symbols that we celebrate in a small church.
So you don't have to do least common denominator, and that's huge. You can do the particular signs and symbols of this community, but beyond that, you named it very well. The size of things in a large congregation are meant to be seen from a different perspective. They are not meant to be interacted with. One of the great powers of small congregations is you can actually have bodies interacting with signs and symbols. So people can come forward and bring a sign of where they have chaos in their life and place it before the cross. anything they can do with their bodies, bringing a candle forward, reading something, someone bringing their favorite rock collection because it is a thing of beauty and placing it. Anytime that you can have those encounters with symbols rather than just watch them, ask any grade school teacher. Go back and think about your own favorite grade school teachers. Humans are designed to encounter the world with our bodies. And so instead of having a sign that or a symbol that we think we know what it means and we'll put it up there, the more senses you can get with people engaging it, the more powerful it becomes. And small congregations can do all of that. I often have congregations do not adorn the sanctuary in advance. Put a cardboard box on the back pew and put in all of the things that might be brought forward, and ask the congregation to decorate the altar, put up the candles, bring other items. And some of what is fascinating about it is a way of enacting our theology. I remember the story of a little girl who brought in one of those big honking Bibles and couldn't make it all the way up on the altar. And so she set it down in front of the altar, but then took one of the cloths and wrapped it around to make it soft and comfortable and beautiful. And you'd better believe that spoke powerfully to this community. That was an action of worship and reverence that wouldn't have worked in a giant setting, but that engagement with signs and symbols that could be done at a small place, powerful stuff.
And for those who are thinking of something like that, but maybe you don't feel creative yourself, first of all, there are creative people in the church who can come up with some of those ideas. Secondly, there's stuff like Pinterest today, where there's all kinds of things that you can discover and you can come across as far more creative than you actually are. We've done this at our church a few times over the last few years. And the one I'm recalling offhand was for a Good Friday service, we had a worship time and we had stations set up. We had a communion station set up and a prayer station set up. But one of them was a large piece of canvas, and it was like 5 feet by 3 feet. It was a good size. It was set up on an easel, and the outline of a cross had been put on in just simply like in masking tape, largely in the middle of it. But everybody was encouraged to go up and grab a paintbrush, dip it into any color of paint, and paint a single word or two words of what the cross means to you. So people will put grace or sacrifice or hope or whatever, and they just write it wherever they wanted until basically the whole thing was filled with these words. And then we just stripped off the masking tape that had the cross outline on it afterwards. And now there's this simple little outline of the cross. And it was on this canvas. It was, like I think 3 by 5 feet. And it became a center art piece in our church for many, many years. And everybody who walked by it, who knew people, looked at it and went, "Oh, that looks pretty cool." Like it didn't even look cheesy. It looked like it was done professionally, whatever, because we had someone, your word, curate it by getting the canvas, by stretching it out, by putting the tape on it in the outline of a cross. Now, have at it, folks. We'll strip that little piece of tape off and it had this wonderful thing. These ideas are everywhere. And then when people see it later, they look back at it and they go, "That's my word. I added." And I would watch people go, "Oh, I added that." Or somebody else saying, "Yeah, my daughter added that." Or this was a prayer actually that I put up and that prayer has been answered.
One of the things I noticed in preaching each week was when I had people bring things forward and arrange the altar or do any of those kinds of things, they were listening to me preach and they would look down at themselves and they would look at the thing that their hands had touched or created and then back at me. So there was a conversation happening among those things that was deeper. And I would also have people come back 2 years later and say, "Teresa, don't you remember what you said that Sunday when I put the picture up on the altar and did..." And of course, I wouldn't remember that, but that tells you just how powerfully that codes us. And the other thing I would say is that sometimes I will hear pastors say, "But we don't have anybody that creative in our congregation." And what I challenge them with is there are people circling your congregation that just haven't felt like they could belong in the pattern of worship that you have. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again is when pastors start operating differently and saying, "Hey, could you just interpret this theme that I'm bringing in here?" Or "What would you say to that people said, I didn't realize I was a church person. I didn't realize that my gifts were worship gifts. And I've seen a number of people end up going into ministry because their gifts were identified by a small congregation pastor. And what they didn't understand was how to just sit still in a pew and watch someone else do it. But they understood deeply what it meant to create events and worship and encounters together.
It is one of the most frequent complaints from pastors in general and small church pastors specifically. Why isn't anybody volunteering? Why can't we get more volunteers? And I think a big part of what we've heard from you is we've created an aesthetic that says sit and watch, not come and participate. And if the only gifts they're seeing in participation are somebody who's leading in worship, in music, or leading in speaking, they look at it and go, I don't sing, I don't speak, so I guess I just sit and watch. But when you begin to create a participation aesthetic and you allow for these other opportunities, then you attract people who are looking to participate in ways that might be outside of those traditional, very narrow formats that we've constructed around us.
I would also say that pastor's role, that is, I will find some people, there's someone in their congregation or maybe even themselves who does all things excellently. They believe that they do most things better than anyone else, and it's maybe even true. But the goal is you hand off as many jobs as humanly possible to get as many different hands and perspectives and gifts brought forward, even if you know someone could do something better than anyone else. It is when we break it apart for full participation, not when we have the most excellent participant we can find, that things begin, that this whole aesthetic begins to shift to something that feels very kingdom of godly.
He's supposed to have the one person who has practice and who can keep on key, who's allowed to sing happy birthday, don't you know? Right. Again, I love that image, because you put that out there and all of a sudden all of these other things just kind of fall to pieces. Well, maybe the best way to sum up your entire book is, I think, or one of the best ways, is how you actually sum up your symbols section. And you say symbols as in things that are symbolic, not things that are attached to the drum kit. Bottom line, you say your worship should not be limited to a few recognized skill sets offered by a few good experts. Small congregations are exactly the places to explore beyond these limitations. But this exploration may require rethinking how you craft worship. If there's anything that's been left out that you would help a small church pastor who's interested in this, but a little bit scared of letting the chaos loose, what would you give as maybe one or two practical words to help them begin to rethink how to craft worship so that there's a more participation aesthetic happening?
And the first thing I would say is start small. Small congregations are really great at resistance. And if you come in with, and now I'm going to tell you all where to go in a different place, you may encounter that real muscularity. So start small. The second thing I would say is it has to do with the way you worship plan. And I encounter all the time people thinking, we tried a worship design team, just craft it all out and see where it all goes. The pastor needs to come up with a month at a time. Here's the scripture and the theme and a symbol. Scripture, theme, symbol. Scripture, theme, symbol. And then spend time handing that to people and asking them to do as many jobs as possible. And maybe just start off with a couple of jobs or 3 jobs. What I see is that sometimes there's this tipping point when congregations go, oh, the pastor really means it. I can do this. And then you start seeing people even begin to clamber to find ways to participate. But I think it starts with that getting comfortable with working differently, from including lots of people. And you will not control lots of people. You can celebrate with lots of people.
One of the many things I really love about this book is, first of all, you do challenge some presuppositions. You do offer some wonderful alternatives, and you get very specific, as you just have, about actually how to curate these things, how to do it in a way where there's a sense of order and propriety to it, but also a sense of freedom and celebration to it. So again, I highly recommend, before we get to the lightning round and before we break for the bonus content, again, I highly recommend The Small Church Advantage, 7 Powerful Worship Practices that work best in small settings. But let's get to the lightning round. 4 questions that everybody has to answer. All right. First of all, what are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to it?
I used to see much more of a silo mentality around resourcing of denominations and congregations. And it started with big ones and then it kind of trickled down. And what I'm seeing now is it's just that miraculous move of there is another way. And denominations and churches across the board looking for other ways to work. I'm finding intrigue about how small congregations are test kitchens and learning laboratories again. 20 years ago, I did not encounter much of that. How I've adapted to it is it's just been a blast because it means every time I go and speak to different groups or encourage, I learn things. We are cross-pollinating with ideas that used to just stay buried at below this line says, and small congregations are here and kind of helpless. So that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. This cross-denominational and cross-traditional pollinating, the lack of siloing is something I want to give a shout out to my big church friends. It's actually something that I write about in my new book coming out, Decising the Church. I write about the positives and some of the ways that the church growth movement went sideways. So one of the real blessings that our big church friends have brought to this is they share everything that they discover with others. Now, at times, as we've talked about, what they share doesn't simply work in a small church context, and we don't have that laid out for us. But the whole dynamic of cross-pollination and not siloing everything within our denomination or within a particular region has been one of those healthy things that we as small churches can excel at as well. I love that idea. The lack of siloing is a huge thing that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years ago. And one of the things that it's easy for us to look at the negatives. It's one of the positives that has come in the last 20 or 30 years that we need to celebrate and enjoy. I appreciate that. Thank you. Second question is this: what free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you would recommend for small church ministry?
Well, this may be a little bit embarrassing, but Karl, I've had your books, but I didn't know about your podcast. So I've gone back and been binging. So the church lobby for sure.
Oh, thank you.
I would also call out the worship nerds. And these are folks really studying with great care and enthusiasm what is happening, mostly in large congregations, but also with the resourcing of the church in the United States. And I think they do a terrific job.
The worship nerds, I've never heard of them. I'll check that out myself.
Fairly new. So long as you remember, our differences in size will affect this, but they do an exquisite job of offering insight.
Great. We will put that in the show notes for sure. Third, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Fall in love with the people. I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a small church, and I got the heck out of there as fast as I could and ran to lots of years of higher education. And I remember going to seminary, and a man by the name of Tech Sample reminded me that the job was not to just learn about, but to fall in love with people again and these patterns. And I've spent the last 30 years falling in love with this ministry setting and people that I knew and sought to leave behind. And my heart has always been there.
Finally, what's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
If I didn't tell this story, someone would call me out. There was a little congregation, about 12 people in a river bottom area that everyone else had moved out of. These were people was really housing as a last resort. And I would come in monthly for communion because I couldn't stand for them not to have someone come by consistently. And they told me one Sunday, you're going to do a pet blessing too. And I didn't think too much about it. And they all showed up in the congregation, 12 people with 12 dogs. And these were mean dogs that hated each other. And so we couldn't come up to the communion rail together. We couldn't do anything together, or they just would have torn each other apart. But they all had horrific stories, like they'd been rescued from a ditch after someone had thrown them out, or they'd been. And I realized that their presence there was as much about a reflection of the people that had brought them, and they brought themselves to this congregation for worship. And when I went around to each one to serve communion to a person, they broke their piece of bread in half and fed it first to the dog and then to themselves. And two of them had a string of saliva that made it from the dog's mouth to theirs. It took me a little bit to kind of
Oh, here I'm thinking that the theology of it was the weird part, but it turns out, no, that's not even the weirdest part.
So their sense of love and being accepted and the graciousness of a particular moment extending, I don't know that they would have had the power or courage to do that in any other setting. But here in this place, God's arms were open wide enough that felt at ease with them. And I realized I was perhaps the one who had shrunk the gospel a little bit.
Fascinating. Well, if people want to follow up with you about any information or help in any way, how can they get a hold of you?
Teresa, Teresa, at smallchurch.org. And I love emails and responding.
There we go. Absolutely. Once again, a reminder, Teresa's book is The Small Church Advantage, 7 Powerful Worship Practices That Work Best in Small Settings. I highly, highly recommend it. It'll challenge some preconceptions. It'll give you some different ways of thinking, and it will give you very practical steps to start implementing this in your congregation in a way that won't overwhelm people or scare people, but will help to get you to an aesthetic that makes far more sense in a smaller congregation. Teresa, thank you so much for your help today. We are going to you and I are going to pause, and then we're going to do our bonus content. We're going to talk about the role of conversation in small church worship. So before we do leave this, a reminder, if you do want to get access to that information, the bonus material, it's on our YouTube channel, but it's only if you have the link. And the way to get the link is you can become a supporter by going to karlvaters.com/support, or you can become a subscriber to our free newsletter by going to karlvaters.com/subscribe. Either way, you can get the bonus content. We'll be doing that on the role of conversation in small church worship with Teresa for about 5 or 10 minutes and give you some important points on that. But thank you again, Teresa, for your time today. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom on this.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
As you can tell from the interview, I got so much out of her book, and I hope you got a lot out of this interview, and I hope you'll pick up Teresa's book as well. But there were a handful of things in the book that simply we didn't have the time to get to in the interview that I would like to talk about because I think they're really important for us to understand. One of the quotes she has in her book is this: "The church seems to have planted a one-way sign between small and large congregations with a confidence that carries the whiff of what she calls toxic charity." And I think this is a really important point for us to understand in small churches. There is this thought process that we as small churches can learn from our big church friends, but there isn't the same feeling either from the big church or from a lot of us in small churches that information can go the other direction. It's only one way from big to small. But the truth of the matter is there's an awful lot the small churches, first of all, can learn from other small churches, but secondly, that small churches can teach big churches and that big churches can learn from us. And we need to be aware of that. And I believe that if we can adopt some of what Teresa is talking about here, that if we can understand the value of small, that it's not less than big, that we're not trying to do what they do, only smaller, but that in fact we have unique contributions to add to the body of Christ, I believe that is going to filter through the entire body of Christ. In fact, that's one of the goals of this ministry. First goal is to encourage small churches. The second goal is to resource small churches. But the third goal is to make sure that we mainstream these ideas in the entire church leadership world to our big church friends as well. So I want to encourage you, as you're looking at adapting new ways of seeing your role in the body of Christ, as you're adapting small church-specific ideas and ideals, some of which we talked about today in the podcast with Teresa, that you're not just doing it for yourself and for your own congregation, that I'm absolutely convinced that as we embrace the value of small, we will also have the opportunity to speak those values into the church as a whole, and that we will bless everybody in churches large and small. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.